My internal flag is flying at half-mast this week. We lost an exceptional environmental hero on March 13th. Find out who next on the GrowthBusters podcast. When we need more champions of the truth about caring for the earth and future generations of every species, who you gonna call?
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa.
This is the GrowthBusters podcast, where we're helping the world come to terms with limits to growth. If what you hear in this episode resonates with you, please share it with friends, family, journalists, and elected representatives. I'm Dave Gardner. I'm recording without Stephanie today because I wanted to jump into the studio and get this episode out ASAP. Famed Stanford scientist Paul Ehlich passed away on March 13th. It's reported that he died of complications of cancer, but he was 93, so his was not a life cut short. Still, it's sad to lose him, because he was a hero to many. He was my top hero for persistently and fearlessly telling the truth in the face of over 50 years of relentless criticism. What was the truth he championed? It was that there are limits to growth, that the laws of physics and biology can't be repealed, that we cannot have perpetual economic and population growth on a finite planet. Ehrlich and his wife Anne wrote The Population Bomb at the suggestion of Sierra Club executive director David Brower. The book and its warnings captured the attention of Johnny Carson, host of The Tonight Show on NBC. Ehrlich appeared on The Tonight Show 28 times, I believe. That helped drive global concern at the time about human overpopulation. I'll share more about that soon, because we'll be honoring Paul in the next several episodes. For now, I want to shut up and let you hear from Paul. For this episode, we're resurrecting episode 110 of the Conversation Earth syndicated radio series that I produced and hosted a decade ago. That episode was titled Behaving Against Our Best Interests, Paul Ehlich. Give this a listen. I expect you'll be astonished at how, in this 2007 interview, he predicted so much of the shit show that is going on today.
We can hit a baseball that's thrown at us at 100 miles an hour. We can dodge a car that swerves towards us. But what evolution never programmed into our nervous systems, because it had no reason to, was changes that go on a decadal scale. So the things that accumulate gradually, we have a great deal of trouble dealing with, be it the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or the number of nuclear weapons.
That's Paul Ehlich, the Stanford biologist famous for pinning the population bomb in 1968. This is Conversation Earth, exploring our place on the planet. I'm Dave Gardner, and in this episode we'll hear Paul Ehrlich's thoughts about economists, politicians, and what keeps us from accurately perceiving the changes humanity is causing on the planet. Paul Ehlich and his wife Anne have co-authored numerous books over the years, but none so famous as The Population Bomb, which was actually about overconsumption as much as it was about human overpopulation. The book struck a chord for many young people who were developing a strong conservation ethic after reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It also struck a nerve for those invested in an economy they thought could grow forever. Paul Ehlich didn't pull any punches. Over his long career as a scientist, his frank and colorful assaults on environmental foolishness have made him a popular speaker. Johnny Carson defied network executives and invited Ehrlich to appear on The Tonight Show time and again to expound on his warnings that humanity was inflicting serious damage on our life-supporting ecosystems. I sat down with Paul for this candid conversation at a picnic table outside his Stanford University office in 2007. Paul, tell me what you know as a scientist about our impact on the planet.
Humanity in the last few hundred years has become the dominant animal on this planet. We are changing and have changed the atmosphere to the point where we're threatening our very sustainability. We are now mobilizing most minerals more rapidly than the natural forces of erosion by wind and water. We are causing an extinction of the working parts of our life support systems, that is the other animals and the plants and the microorganisms of the planet, at a scale unseen in the last 65 million years. And you've got to remember, we've only been around for a few 100,000 ourselves. So we have made dramatic changes that are changing the ecology and evolution of every organism on the planet, every plant, animal, and microorganism, including ourselves.
Is there a way to measure or express our impact? I know years ago you and John Holdren developed a formula.
The impact can be seen as the product of three different factors. One is the size of the population. Obviously, if you have 5 people, your impact on life support systems is going to be less than if you have 5 billion people. So the formula is I equals P times A times T. I is the impact, P is the population size, A is affluence. It's basically how much each person consumes. If you have 5 million people driving Hummers, you have more impact than if you have 5 million people walking to work. So P, population, times affluence or per capita consumption, times T, which is the technologies that you use to service the consumption. Again, if you use Hummers to get around, you are going to have a bigger impact than if you use Priuses to get around, and you're going to have a bigger impact in the Priuses than if you're going to take a bike.
The scientific community largely agrees human impact is now so significant it's a problem. You said yourself, we're pushing other species off the planet. But there are frequent debates, at least among non-scientists, about whether overpopulation is the problem or overconsumption.
Well, some people seem to think you can solve the problem, say, by ignoring population growth, but concentrating on reducing each person's level of consumption. Well, you could do that, except there are a couple things wrong with it. One is we're already way, way above what the planet can sustain in the long term, so we ought to be working on all three factors. 2 is, of course, if you manage somehow to halve each person's consumption on average, and of course there's a couple billion people who consume so little now, if you halved them, they die. But you allow population size to double, you haven't gained at all. Because if you have half as much consumption per person, but twice as many persons, you're right where you started from. And you can say the same for the technology function. That is, if people travel less and less distance, but use more and more powerful automobiles to do it, again, you could stay right in the same place while operating on one of the three factors. So you really have to look at all three and the product at the same time.
Well, that makes perfect sense. But there is something, often called the population taboo, preventing acceptance of population as a big part of the sustainability equation.
Well, a lot of people think that at least they won't talk about population because they consider it a non-PC topic. In some senses, we have gone further on the population issue than any other because most people who are alertable to the population problem are alerted. Only people who have to take off their shoes to count up to 20 don't understand we have a population problem. But also, in the last 20 or 30 years, we figured out what needs to be done about it. For example, by educating women, giving them job opportunities, giving them access to contraception and abortion, you can get birth rates way down. And in fact, many of the most advanced countries have done exactly that. They have already reduced their birth rates. Some European countries are shrinking in size. It's only the really backward countries with lousy leadership, like the United States, that haven't done anything about their population problem and are still growing like skyrockets. So, in a sense, we're on the way to solving the population problem. The problem is that not enough has been done. The most recent calculations are that a sustainable population, which gave people a maximum number of options, would be about 2 billion or 1.5 billion people. We now have 6.5, and we seem to be doomed to go probably to 8.5 or 9, unless we're very unlucky in having a catastrophe or very lucky in having people change their attitudes very rapidly. So we're maybe 3 times above or 4 times above the optimum already. And so we should be doing a lot more, but at least there's no huge mystery about what to do.
Now, current UN projections have world population growth coming to an end within 100 years. Some people are saying problem solved.
There are a lot of people who think we can relax because population growth is projected to level off. What you got to remember is it's projected to level off adding more people than were alive on the entire planet when I was born. That is, it's going to level off and we have 2 to 3 billion more people if we're lucky. 2 to 3 billion people when we're already marginal on water and food and maintaining our ecosystem services is just too damn many people. And so we should be working much harder on the population factor.
What about nations trying to reverse their population declines? We see a lot of warnings about too few babies.
Lots of politicians are panicked about population decline, which is mostly a measure of the IQ of politicians, because of course gradual population decline is exactly what we want. The standard arguments for keeping population growing are spherically senseless. That is, they're stupid from whatever position you look at them. I mean, what do people say? Well, first of all, we are having a problem of too many old people for the young people, for the working people to support. Well, what they miss, of course, is that we have fewer children for the working people to support. The dependency ratio is those under 15 and those over 65. Well, it's a hell of a lot easier to make those over 65 productive than it is to make those under 15 productive. So one of the things that's happening is we're actually getting a better dependency ratio. It's actually possible for people who are over 65 to make contributions to society. Second, what's another age group that's shrinking is the 17 to 28 age group. That's the criminal age class. In the United States, we spend billions and billions of dollars on the criminal age class, warehousing them in lousy prisons. Going to be fewer of them to do as the population ages. So sooner or later, you're going to have to stop population growth. When population growth stops, it's mathematics. The population is going to get to be older. And so the issue is, do we deal with whatever problems there are stopping population growth now? Or do we pass them on to our grandchildren? And of course, many people would pass them on to their grandchildren because they don't care about the future. What did posterity ever do for them?
It appears that climate change has finally begun to get our attention. Are we on the right track or doing way too little?
I am, of course, happy that more and more people are finally getting accustomed to the idea of climate change. This is something that's been obvious to the scientific community since at least the 1960s when I was first writing about it, and really since the end of the last century when people first did the calculations that CO2 added to the atmosphere was going to create problems. So I'm happy that it's getting more attention. I'm unhappy about two things, I guess, basically. One is people have no clue as to how bad it could be and how much we have to do to really make a difference. In other words, a huge amount of the change is already entrained. The gases are already in the atmosphere. They're not going to disappear. That's one thing. The second thing is that many of my colleagues would feel that climate change isn't the most serious of the environmental problems that we face. So I'm glad that people are paying attention to climate change, but I'm sad that they don't see how extremely serious it could be, the extreme steps that would really need to be taken to do anything about it, and the fact that many other environmental problems like decay of the epidemiological environment, toxification of the planet, land use change, and particularly the destruction of biodiversity could end up in the long term being much worse. We have to really change our ways and look at the entire environmental problem and the related problems, deeply related problems of economic inequity, racial inequity, gender inequity, and so on, all as a single package, or in my view, we're not going to have the kind of society in 50 years that I would like to have, but then fortunately I'll be dead.
When you and your wife wrote the book, One with Nineveh, what were you hoping to accomplish?
People are well aware, again, those that are smart enough to be able to count up to 20 without removing their shoes, that we have a population problem. The general public also understands that a lot of our technologies are not environmentally friendly. That is, people are beginning to buy cars that are more efficient, not efficient enough, but they're starting in the direction. They understand that a lot of our technologies could be better and cause problems for us. But the issue of consumption was far from the front lines. Every time there's a slightest glitch in the economy, what do the politicians get out there and say? Consume more, buy another refrigerator, get yourself 3 more Hummers, and so on. And so one of the main reasons we did that we wrote the book One with Nineveh, was to try and bring the consumption issue to the fore. A prime example, of course, has been the United States' horrendous dependence upon petroleum. Petroleum is something, of course, we should have been phasing away from for the last 20 or 30 years. We should not be burning fossil fuels any more than we have to, for a number of reasons, but the main one, of course, being connected to climate change. But another one is there's a limited supply, and the supply is not where it's easily accessible to us if we're citizens of the United States. You know, one of the great ethical mysteries in the world is how did our oil get under their sand? This has led, for instance, to the first great resource war. The first major one was over water between the Arabs and the Israelis in '67, but the U.S. empire attacking Iraq to try and get control of the second largest supply of oil on the planet. It's the first really big one. We're going to see more of that. About 50% of the American empire's armed forces are aimed at controlling petroleum flows, even though we shouldn't be burning petroleum. That's the crazy thing about it. The book is named One with Nineveh because Nineveh is in the outskirts of Mosul in Iraq. And when they found the ruins of Nineveh, it was a disaster area. It was just all rubble. But when they excavated it, they found out there were huge palaces. It was a great empire. And it was an empire that went down the drain by not paying attention to environmental issues, in part, about 2,600 years ago. As somebody once said, Churchill created Iraq by trying to unite two oil wells, one at Kirkuk and one at Mosul, by bringing together three disparate peoples, the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds. And we just have not learned the lessons of history. Our empire hasn't learned from the British. The One with Nineveh in the title comes from a poem by the imperialist poet of Britain, Rudyard Kipling, who was sort of looking back on things in his poem Recessional, which became a song sung in many a hymn in Episcopalian churches. And one of the lines is, or one of the stanzas is, far flung our navies melt away, on dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. And our pomp of yesterday, you can see it in the way these issues are discussed in what passes for intellectual discourse in the United States. That is, the Sunday morning idiot shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, on which there's never a competent technical sentence uttered, where none of the huge problems facing society are ever discussed. Everything is seen as which politician is raising more money to get to be president. And it's just plain insanity. Here's a rant for you. You'll never use it, but that's okay.
Circling back to climate change, I noticed that all solutions being seriously considered by policymakers have one catch. They can't hamper economic growth. What do you think about our current obsession with economic growth?
Well, it's interesting that politicians are obsessed with economic growth, and so are second-rate economists. World-class economists are beginning to understand. Our group has published several articles now with Kenneth Arrow, the agreed to be most smartest economist on the planet, has Nobel Prize. Partha Dasgupta, who was president of both the European and the British economic associations, and a whole series of very distinguished economists and ecologists asking the question, are we consuming too much? Looking at issues like, should the economy grow forever, and what does that mean? Interestingly, all the studies that have been done show that once your basic needs are satisfied, people don't get happier with more growth. And so the issue is, who's promoting growth, what kind of growth, and it all ties back to the consumption issue, but it's extremely complicated. For example, let's suppose you have $50 million you want to blow on a present for your wife. And the issue is, do you get her a Van Gogh, or do you buy her an executive jet? Now, both are consumption, but quite obviously, it's going to be ecologically sounder to get her the Van Gogh than to get her the jet. And so you have an issue both of the total quantity of consumption and also an issue of the composition of consumption. What is it spent on? And there are all kinds of issues, technical issues there of the social costs of various things we do, which I won't get into. So it is a fairly complex issue, but at least people who know how to deal with those issues, who know how to calculate shadow, or at least guesstimate shadow prices and so on, are beginning to look at it. And that's a positive trend, although it's going to be a long time before the idiots who write the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal or the Economist magazine, or mostly English majors, ever catch up with it.
If we somehow continue to meet these unquestioned economic growth goals, the kind we do read about, not just in the Wall Street Journal, but in AP reports and daily newspapers around the world, what will our future look like?
Well, if we undergo the business as usual scenario and meet the kind of economic goals that, say, a sort of economist who works for the Wall Street Journal would predict, then the future's easy. Almost all of us will be dead, and we'll be living miserable lives. I mean, it's really easy. You don't need any great predictive powers because the amount of energy we would use, the amount of materials we would use will wreck the climate system. The poor people who are going to be the first dispossessed, probably, as the climate and the planet in general change, are more and more armed with nuclear weapons. One does not have to really have a very good crystal ball to see that in 50 or 100 years, the world's going to be so different that we would not recognize it.
Paul, you've painted a bleak picture under that business as usual scenario. I think the Growth Boosters will tell you technology will save the day.
When I wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, there were 3.5 billion people in the world. And the technological optimists came out of the woodwork and said, this is just ridiculous. We can easily feed, house, give wonderful lives to even 5 billion people. It's a cinch. We will have nuclear agro-industrial complexes. We will grow algae on sewage, and people will, scarf it up. It's going to be just great. Well, we now have 6.5 billion people. 3 billion of them, roughly, live on less than $2 a day, lives of misery. Where is the technology that's taking care of everybody? In other words, you keep hearing these predictions, but they don't seem to be feeding the poor. It doesn't seem to be giving a reasonable break to people with the wrong skin color. All the serious human problems that we faced in 1968 and before are still here, or worse, thanks to technology. So yeah, there's a lot of things technology could do to help. Genetic engineering, for instance, could help to feed the poor. It could help to produce medicines for the poor. But is genetic technology feeding the poor or producing medicines for the poor? Hell no. It's making profits for big pharma. It's making profits for big industry in general, and that's not the poor. The gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. And the status of our life support systems, as anybody who watches TV or reads the newspapers can see, is going down the drain. And now they want to talk about having huge geophysical experiments to try and stop the global warming by putting shades out in space or adding things like iron filings to the ocean. Huge experiments where we haven't got the first clue what their results are going to be. So yeah, I've run into a lot of technological optimists. I've run into none of them that actually have come up with a huge technological solution for any of our problems. Not a single one of our problems has been solved by a brand new technology developed to solve it. They're always talking about the technological rabbit that they're going to pull out of a hat and that's going to solve all of our problems. The trouble is that technological rabbits often turn out to have very smelly and messy droppings.
What do you think is keeping us from making better choices?
I think the main thing that works against us is the concentration of power, and I don't know what one does about that. It's a historic trend that started thousands of years ago as we built states and so on, and the people who have a great interest in lining their own pockets and no interest at all in what happens to future generations control, for instance, most of the media. And so one of the big problems is we may be in an information age, but people seem to have less and less information and more disinformation.
Are there some traits of the human race, some instincts or sociological phenomena that also get in the way?
We are very good at detecting rapid changes. After all, we had millions of years of evolution in which being able to detect a charging lion was a very good thing. And we still have that. We can, after all, hit a baseball that's thrown at us at 100 miles an hour. We can dodge a car that swerves towards us. But what we never got to do evolutionarily, what evolution never programmed into our nervous systems because it had no reason to, was changes that go on a decadal scale, that go on very slowly, not in the play that's going on before us, but in the ecological stage, basically, on which it's set. So the things that accumulate gradually, we have a great deal of trouble dealing with, be it the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or the number of nuclear weapons in weapons stores. We're basically a small group animal, used to living in groups of 50 to 150 people. We're culturally not well designed to deal with massive problems created by masses of people. And our nervous systems are logically designed. After all, our genes don't determine what we think or how we behave in large part. They determine the basic structure of a brain that is programmed over about 25 years to deal with the world as we see it and to make all kinds of shortcuts that are conservative. That is, we have to fit everything in to our brains in some sense. And so we take very simple schemas of how things are rather than really look at them in detail. And it makes it very hard to deal with brand new information, particularly when much of that information is gathered in ways you have no clue about. In other words, the average person has no idea how the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is detected, or how their genes really work, or how their brains work. And in fact, scientists only have partial ideas on this. So we're faced with a gigantic challenge that we haven't been prepared for, either in our genetic evolution or, more importantly, in our cultural evolution. And our only real hope is to work very hard at changing our cultural evolution so that people learn to recognize these things.
Let's circle back to population growth. On a micro level, we see many communities competing to be the fastest growing. If the world is overpopulated, is this a productive activity?
A lot of it has to do with this thought that only economic growth can bring people happiness. Only bigger communities will help because it increases the tax base. We never sit back and ask the question of what the hell are people for? What do you want to, what do you want with your life? I can see changes in my own lifetime. When Anne and I were married, it was still barely possible for me to work while she, at the beginning, raised our young daughter. Now almost all couples have to both work in order to make ends meet. And that's why we're having this wonderful economic growth. It's just nonsensical. I mean, I think most people would much prefer to have a relaxed life, to be able to have good friends and have an adequate supply of food and booze and so on, make love when they want to, not only on the weekends, and have a very different kind of life. But we have been persuaded, particularly by control of the media, by large corporations and so on, to believe that you have to keep running ever faster in place to get more and more junk to consume. You can design a different system. Somebody's got to do it, but can you get anyone to adopt it as long as almost all the pressure is in the opposite direction?
Okay, so what should we be doing? How do we get to that different system?
We need to be doing a lot of things. First thing is changing our educational system so that people learn about the important things rather than the crap. And I mean the educational system from L high right on through major universities. The structure of our major universities traces primarily to Aristotle and the Royal Society in about 1690. That's where the disciplines come from. They no longer fit anything, and very few universities are doing much about it. Stanford is one of the leaders in trying to do something about it, but it's extremely tough because universities are only slightly more conservative than the church. So that's one thing we need to do. Second thing, I think the main thing that needs to be done is we need to start a global discussion base for talking about what's going on, and particularly the ethical issues, the power issues, and so on and so forth. It's going to be very difficult. It's not a matter of needing more science to know what to do. We can use more science, but the big problem is, why is there such a gap between what the scholarly community knows and what the politicians and public know and are willing to do anything about? So we think we need a millennium assessment of human behavior. That is a huge global program to talk about how human beings behave, why they behave that way, how they ought to behave, and that includes not just scientists, but ethicists and people from the religious community and so on and so forth, to really start discussing these issues. And subtext of it would be, how do you develop consumption condoms so that we don't consume so much? How do you see to it that we move faster on population issues? And a whole series of critical issues which just are lost in the public discourse today.
You've been listening to a conversation with biologist Paul Ehlich recorded in 2007. Of course, the population figures he used no longer apply. The 6.5 billion world population he mentioned has grown to 7.2 billion. The scenario that projected world population leveling off at 8.5 or 9 billion now envisions world population exceeding 11 billion. The 8.5 billion world population projected for 2050 is now expected to be reached in 2030. I'm Dave Gardner, and this has been Conversation Earth, exploring our place on the planet. That was episode 110 of the Conversation Earth syndicated radio series I produced and hosted a decade ago. The interview was recorded in 2007. That 7.2 billion population figure I shared at the end of that episode was as I recorded the open and close in 2015. We've added another billion since then. We're now growing a little more slowly, but growing nevertheless. I'm sharing that interview here to honor the late Dr. Paul Ehlich, the infamous Stanford biologist who fearlessly spoke up for the Earth and all her inhabitants, especially those not yet born. I remember he once told me, "I want as many people as possible to enjoy life on Earth, just not all at once." See the show notes for links to learn more about him, and we'll hear more from Paul in the next episode. So please follow the GrowthBusters podcast so you don't miss this wisdom. I'll try to get Stephanie to join me for that episode. Meanwhile, please share this podcast with friends, family, journalists, and elected representatives. And support this podcast by clicking on Donate at growthbusters.org. We've got a planet to save.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.